whatever it is, bad behavior they're doing, but they want a different result. That's the definition of insanity. I saw a young man who was questioning the idea of how long it takes to build this infrastructure in city. And he gave the example of a area in 1840, between 1840 and 1860, that didn't have anything. It was just a big vacant nothing. And then within 20 years, there's this huge metropolis, this huge city in the US. And he's like, okay, when he's questioning the history behind this and says, you know, like, there's just no way that could have happened because there was no central planning. Like, and I'm like, well, I'm watching this. And of course, as a small business owner, and any small business owners will tell you this, that central planning is usually the reason why you can't get anything done in the span of 20 years. In fact, think about it like this. The Empire State Building was built between 1930 and 1931. It took 13 months, not 13 years, not like the so-called Freedom Tower in Manhattan. It took however long that took. It took more than that time to get the permits to build that, because of the so-called central planning, right? When you don't have central planning, business owners get things done very quickly, like very quickly, because it's our money on the line. We don't have all day to mess with this kind of stuff. We can't spend weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks preparing to prepare to get ready, to get going, to get maybe thinking about it. Like, dude, like, that's not how any of that works. The people who do all the actual work, right? We show up and we get shit done. That's how you get a giant city that exists in 20 years, is because the people show up. And if you look at, you know, the time in the US between 1840 and 1860, that was the one of the most prosperous times, right? And people did a lot of stuff. And before you start chiming in with slavery, keep this in mind. Most people did not own slaves. Vast majority of all people in the US did not own slaves. Something like, I've heard conflicting numbers, but somewhere between 1% and maybe 4% owned a slave. That means that 90+% of people did not. And those 90+% of people are the ones who built all of those big cities, because they could keep their money. They didn't have a parasitical relationship at that point. And this is the part that, unfortunately, and I pick on the right all the time, but this is where I get to really pick on the leftists out there. They didn't have the parasitic nature of government. That's your police departments. They weren't having to fund a bunch of military excursions. They weren't having to fund a bunch of other countries, particularly countries in the Middle East. They didn't have to fund a bunch of other craziness for people to sit around and theorize all day long. And they weren't paying for a bunch of permits, and they weren't having to fund a bunch of so-called central planners. That's how they get all this stuff done so quickly. That's how all this stuff works in the real world. So when you get rid of the parasitic state, you know, then you free it up for small businesses. Now, of course, the idea is, oh, but the big mega corporations. Yeah, you know how you keep a big mega corporation from becoming a big mega corporation, leftists? It's really simple. You have hard currency, and that stops all of that crap. They can't grow, because they have to then pay real wages. Remember, you guys are the ones who supposedly are all all for the working class. Okay, well, as a member of the working class myself, who does a bunch of shit every day that, you know, that other people don't want to do or can't do, okay? Well, if you have a hard currency and they have to pay me in a hard currency to do all the work, well, then they're going to go out of business very quickly, because the people who do all the work will eventually absorb all the wealth, which is what happened. You know, in the U.S., it siphoned all of the wealth out of the U.S., out of the world, largely because the people that were there were the ones who were willing to do the work, because the understanding was that they could keep what they made. That's how that worked, right? When you're keeping 100% of what you make, and maybe you're donating 1% or 0.1% of your earnings to try and, you know, help out the so-called community, right? Well, then it's pretty easy to have all of that happen. Okay, so, and it keeps the idea of the mega corporation from even existing in the first place, because the only reason those exist is because of fiat money, because of endless amounts of large S. You've heard me say it on many occasions. If you want solutions, I mean, like, I keep giving people, so I get every now and again, I'll get somebody who says, like, well, how come you never provide a solution? Like, dude, I provide solutions all the time. They're not solutions you want to hear, right? Think of it like this. let's say I'm a nutritionist. I'm not, but let's say I was a nutritionist, and you come to me and you're like, man, Axel, you got to help me. I'm like 350 pounds overweight. And I'm like, okay, dude, stop eating high fructose corn syrup. Stop eating 6 pounds of food per meal. Cut back on some of this stuff. Or just cut out sodas, things like I just tell you some basic run-of-the-mill stuff, right? And then you're like, no, I need a solution. I'm giving you a solution. No, you don't understand. Like, no, I do understand. I'm giving you a solution, but you don't like the solution. The solution is that you have to not engage in that behavior, right? I don't want a bunch of crazy STDs. Okay, then you need to not let random guys fuck you all the time. I mean, like, no, I need a solution. That is a solution, right? You understand? Like, it's just not a solution you want to hear, because it's a solution that actually does work. And no, I mean, what it is usually is that, as with most people, they want to maintain whatever it is bad behavior they're doing, but they want a different result. That's the definition of insanity, if you want to look it up. So anyway, that's how you can have a city go from dirt in the Midwest, in 20 years to a giant thriving metropolis. That's how you get that to happen. You get the hell out of the way of people and you leave them alone, and they will build stuff. Like, well, but what about these companies who pollute? Well, there was a ruling called the Slaughterhouse Rule, and the Supreme Court has never overturned that. And so since the Supreme Court has never overturned that, you can sue your neighbor if they pollute your private property. Like, this is why private property is a thing. Now, again, remember, there's personal property, private property. I mean, like, not to get into muddy the waters there. We can talk about that on another time, but just understand that that's how that works. That if you have private property and your neighbor pollutes your property, well, then you have a just claim. Okay, and then they get to be held responsible for it. All you do is just start holding people responsible for their actions. That's all you got to do. So, hope that makes sense.